Hey, this is TJ from tjontheroad.com. Today we're going to have some fun for all my fellow guitar playing fools who could never understand synthesizers but always wanted to know. I'm going to explain some basics of synthesizers in a way that I know the guitar players can understand. Because believe it or not, with all the gear the guitar players have, and we all have a lot of gear, you have a lot more in common with synthesizers than you may imagine. So let's first talk about things the guitar players already know. Well, you've got your guitar, okay? It's got 6 strings on it, right? We already know this. It's got tone and volume knob on it, and it's got a switch for each individual pickup. You've also got all these pedals. They've got knobs, switches. I don't know what that one does. All right, this stuff's easy to understand for any guitar player. And lastly, you got your amplifier. It's got all the knobs and switches, basic stuff that you can understand, volume, tone knobs, switches for different channels. You know all this stuff, right? Believe it or not, synthesizers have all the same types of knobs and switches. They just call them different things. So don't be intimidated when you hear terms like oscillator and filter and envelope, LFO, mixer drive, sequencer, subtractive, modulation, polyphonic, monophonic. Believe it or not, this is stuff that you already know. It's just called different things on synthesizers, and I'm going to show you how they match up. So what the heck is an oscillator anyway? Well, oscillators are used on synthesizers at the beginning of the signal chain to create the basic sound that is later manipulated for the final sound that you hear from the synthesizer. Does a guitar have an oscillator? Well, in fact, it has 6 of them. Those are the strings on your guitar. In fact, your guitar is a 6-voice polyphonic synthesizer. Now, when you play one string at a time for your awesome solo, you're really turning your guitar into a monophonic synthesizer. Right here, I've got a mixer. We've all seen mixers before. Mixers are used to take multiple sources to a single output. They have level controls and they have gain controls associated with them. Synthesizers use mixers down the chain from oscillators in order to mix them to one source, to whatever level that you want the multiple oscillators to be. Now, with this, if you put too much input into it, it's probably going to sound pretty nasty. You raise the gain too much, it's going to sound nasty. With synthesizers, though, they're often designed to be overdriven at the input source and or to be overdriven to the output in order to create a pleasing sound. Very similar to your amplifier. When you overdrive the input, it often creates that great overdriven sound. All right, now let's talk about filters. Synthesizers use filters to either reduce the amount of highs from the oscillators or the lows from the oscillators, or they also can sweep the mid-range. Do guitar players use filters? Well, they sure do. At least I hope you do, because it's right here on your guitar. It's your tone knob. You do use your tone knob, right? All right, your tone knob on your guitar is basically a low-pass filter. That being, it lets the lower frequencies pass through to the output of your guitar. Where else is it used? Well, your favorite overdrive pedal probably has a bass knob and a treble knob or a tone knob associated with it. That's just a filter. Let's look at your amp. Your amp has tone knobs associated with them. They're just basically filters on your amplifier. So what the heck is resonance anyway? Well, resonance is used in synthesizers, specifically in the filter section, to emphasize the frequency, to bump up that frequency of which is being filtered at the top end of it. Do guitar players use resonance? Well, they certainly do with wah-wah pedals. Wah-wah pedals emphasize the frequency of which the pedal is set at. Let's talk about drive when it comes to synthesizers. You have the oscillators that are fed into the mixer, then the output of the mixer is fed into the filter section for most synthesizers. Filters often have a drive control in them that gives it another level of overdrive that's fed into the filter. Now, guitar players, do they use that? They sure do. You've got your pedals, right? Your pedal feeds an additional amount of drive that you can set into your amplifier. So let's talk about envelopes. Synthesizers use envelopes to change the sound over time. Now, envelopes are used to often change the sound of the filter, to open or close the filter over time. They're used to raise the level, the amplitude of the sound over time. They're often used to change the variation of the sound over time, say the vibrato or some other type of variation. Do guitar players use envelopes? Well, sort of, because the guitar itself is its own envelope generator. When you pluck a string, it has an immediate attack associated with it. It also is a little bit sharp because the string is stretched more than it is when it's relaxed over time. As it relaxes over time, it has a decay. It decays in the amount of high frequency content as well as it decays in the amount of level over time. And then it has a sustain. It has a length of which it sustains at a certain level. And then it will have often a release. That release will be a very quick release to the next note. So what the heck does LFO mean? Well, LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. Yes, there's that term oscillator again. They are similar in the oscillators that we talked about before, except they run at a frequency that is very low, lower than the human hearing. So what good is that? Well, low frequency oscillators are used to manipulate the sound of other parts of the synthesizer. Say, for example, the pitch. When you hear the pitch going woo, 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 that's usually done with a low frequency oscillator, an LFO. Do guitar players use LFOs? Well, they sure do. Right here I got a phaser pedal. Now, the phaser pedal has a rate associated with it. Now, you often hear that whoosh type sound, woo, 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 woo. That is done with a low frequency oscillator, say with this phaser pedal, a flanger pedal, a chorus pedal, any type of modulation pedal uses a low frequency oscillator. Next, we're going to talk about modulations that occur within synthesizers. Now, guitar players do generally understand modulations because we all use modulation type pedals that manipulate things like pitch. It'll manipulate the time of a delay pedal or the amount of the delay pedal. It'll manipulate the amount of chorus and so forth that you may use with a modulation pedal. But a synthesizer takes that same concept and goes a lot further. The synthesizer can modulate all those very same things, but can also modulate other things, such as the amount of reaction of that modulation. Now, this is a little bit more deeper concept, but the point is that a synthesizer has a source of modulation and it has a destination of modulation. You select the source, say for example, the low frequency oscillator, LFO, and then you can select the destination, say for example, the amount of filter and its cutoff point. Modulations are used in synthesizers to help create more interesting sounds. They help the synthesizer be less static in sound over time. They help the synthesizer be more vibrant, more interesting, more pleasing to the ear, or more crazy, depending on what you're looking for. Next, let's talk about sequencers. What the heck is a sequencer on a synthesizer? Well, a sequencer is basically a looper, but the difference is it doesn't loop audio, it loops specific types of data, that being the notes that you play on the synthesizer, or it may loop other types of data, that being the movements of the knobs on the synthesizer. That movements can be either in pitch, it can be the amount of filter that you apply, the amount of resonance, anything on the synthesizer can be recorded most times into the sequencer that can be looped over and over again to manipulate the sound that you hear at the output. Do guitar players use sequencers? Well, they use loopers. This is a simple looper pedal. It loops audio, but the principle is basically the same. Now, earlier we touched a little bit on the differences between a polyphonic synthesizer and a monophonic synthesizer. Now, your guitar, as I said before, is a polyphonic instrument. It can play multiple voices at the same time. An acoustic piano is a polyphonic instrument. It can play as many voices as your hands can get their hands on. A saxophone or a flute, for example, they are monophonic instruments. They can only play one voice at a time. Synthesizers come in either polyphonic or monophonic form, or they also come in what's called paraphonic form. The differences between them are obviously a polyphonic synthesizer has a maximum amount of voices of which it can play at one time. that's very different on all kinds of different synthesizers. Oftentimes, say for example, those voices are layered to create even more complicated type sounds. You might have a piano sound for one set of sounds, and then you might have a string sound underneath it. Those all take a specific amount of voices. So the maximum amount of voices which can be used in the synthesizer is important for the amount of complexity, particularly in a polyphonic synthesizer. A monophonic synthesizer generally can only play one voice at a time. Why would you want to have a synthesizer that only plays one voice at a time? Well, there are a number of reasons. Monophonic synthesizers are a lot less expensive most times than polyphonic synthesizers, and also they have a lot of tricks associated with them that can make them sound a lot more wider range than you might think that you can get from one voice at a time. Now, often monophonic synthesizers can be set to run in what's called paraphonic mode. Now, paraphonic mode means that, say for example, it has 3 oscillators. That means all 3 oscillators can be run separately for a maximum number of 3 voices. The difference is that when those 3 voices are blended, those 3 voices will be sent through the same filter and the same envelopes. That's different than a true polyphonic synthesizer. When all of those voices are blended, they are actually sent to their own individual filter and own individual envelopes, which allows them to be a little bit more complex in sound. Lastly, today I want to talk about the different types of synthesizers, or more accurately, the different types of synthesis that is available within their sound engines. Now, the most common type is what's called subtractive synthesis, and that's pretty much what we've talked about mostly today. Subtractive synthesis takes the sound of the oscillators, the basic sound that usually has a lot of complexity associated with them, and it'll subtract some of that complexity out of them using the filters, the envelopes, and the different parts of the synthesizers to create the final result. There are other types. We're not going to talk about the details of those in this video. We'll talk about a little bit them more later, but those types are commonly what's called frequency modulation, or FM synthesis, wavetable synthesis, sample-based synthesis, vector synthesis, additive synthesis. There's physical modeling, granular synthesis, West Coast style synthesis, or spectral synthesis. All these different types are just different ways to create different sounds. In many ways, they're like your guitar. You have probably a lot more than one guitar, and they have different ways to create different sounds. So in an upcoming video, I'm going to talk a little bit further about these different types of synthesis and how they work. But for today, you've got a basic overview of the terminology of synthesizers and how it relates to your guitar and your guitar gear. Well, that's it for today. We talked about synthesizers, their basic terminology, and how they can relate to ways guitar players all know about their own gear. In an upcoming video, we're going to dive a little bit deeper again to the different types of synthesis, and we're going to explain a little bit about the workflow that is involved with synthesizers. So please do subscribe to this channel. I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. And also, please do check out tjontheroad.com for more things to come.